Well, hello there from the Admirals Club at DFW. It pains me greatly not to be able to be there with you today, but I did want to take the opportunity to share my presentation and welcome your questions and comments, and you can email me and get that information from Jeremy or Amanda. What I wanted to talk about, what I want to share with you today is all about hope and possibility, and it's about transformation. And it's about the importance and need for change and how we do things as it relates to mental health and veterans and their family members. So in order to do that, I'm going to start with sharing a story of our journey at Boulder Crest and how we got to where we are today. So our journey began and our place opened on September 6, 2013 in Bluemont, Virginia. And as you can see in the picture, it's a beautiful place. And there's a wonderful backstory that you can read up on our website about how we came to be. And when we opened, we had two missions. The first mission was to host combat veterans and their families for 2 to 7 nights for free to provide a place for respite, for rest, and for reconnection. The second thing we wanted to do was to be a place where organizations that were doing good work in a retreat setting could come for free, who were under $1 million in revenue, and have the opportunity to host their programs and not have to pay for them, because that's the biggest cost for those types of organizations. And so over the course of our first 6 to 8 months, we hosted a range of programs. They were 1 day, 3 day, 5 day, 7 day, 15 day, for MST, for PTSD, for couples issues, for depression and anxiety. They were run by clinicians and non-clinicians, a combination by peer support and veterans and the gamut. And to be quite frank, what we saw was troubling. A lot of these programs weren't that good. And in addition to that, more importantly, they were a catch and release. And what that means is that someone would have an experience for 3 or 5 days, get a pat on the back, and be sent home to whatever their life would be, and likely as it was before. And I think most importantly to us is that the folks who were doing these programs, especially on the therapeutic side, weren't that well. They weren't in a good position to be able to assist others and to lead others, because they didn't know how to struggle well in their own life. And that led Ken Falkers, our chairman and founder, to decide that he wanted to take a journey around the country. And Ken really wanted to focus and get smart on PTSD and combat stress. And he wanted to get smart on that because he was a Navy bomb disposal guy, retired as a Master Chief, had a training background, combat veteran, but didn't know much about mental health. And so Ken took a journey across the United States and as well as the world, and met with experts on these subjects, on PTSD and trauma and military psychology and moral injury, and the rest of it. And these were psychiatrists and psychologists. They were in the VA and they were in the private system. There were coaches and other kinds of people who work with those who struggle. And what they told Ken time and time and time again was that the system and the treatments weren't working. And he would then ask, logically, well, why do you keep doing them? And the response would be, it's what insurance covers and it's all we have. And that was disheartening, of course, because in many respects, that meant that there was a sentence on the lives of those who were struggling, that they were destined to live the rest of their lives as diminished versions of themselves, and that there was no hope that their life would ever be anything like it used to be. And while that was dispiriting to Ken, the numbers actually bear out the fact that that is true. And so when you look at the chart over here, what you see is a general statement of what we believe to be the population in need. Approximately 700,000, it may even be 800,000 combat veterans from the post-9/11 era who have some form of anxiety, depression, PTSD, combat stress, or other type of mental health challenges. And what keeps 50% of that number from ever going to mental health are things like stigma, risk of security clearance, and other sorts of things that prevent people from seeking mental health help. Now, it's important to know, because I think this community gets a bad rap, that that number is the same for any community of people. 50% will never go to a mental health person. So you then look at the next number. So now we're dealing with about, let's just say, 350,000 people. And that next number looks at the fact that the dropout rate when it comes to combat veterans and service members is somewhere around 67 to 90%. And it varies a lot, but you can see numbers up to 67 to 90%. So you then take a huge slash at that 350,000 number and get down to 115,000 who will actually complete evidence-based treatments. So this is where the question of whether the treatments work may be moot if people don't actually go through and experience the entire treatments. You then look at the fact that only about 40% of people will benefit who complete treatments, and your number goes down to something about 46,000. And then we look at what I think is one of the most important parts of this, which is remission. Because ultimately, if you have a PTSD diagnosis and your symptoms get a little bit less, but not enough where you no longer have PTSD, your sense and your feeling about what's possible in your life is limited. Your potential is diminished in a permanent sense. And so that number takes us down to 15,000 people out of 700,000 who need help, who will actually get help in a permanent sense. And when we think about what that looks like, what that verdict on someone's life, what that death sentence and that sentence of hopelessness looks like, it looks like this graph here, which is you're experiencing life at a certain level. Things happen or a thing happens. We tend to believe that all trauma is complex, meaning it's all aggregative and cumulative, is that over the course of time you experience that and it knocks you off your course in a significant way. You come down to the bottom of that curve and you struggle. And what our system can provide you with is about a 30% improvement in your symptoms. That may or may not be fleeting, but that's it. This is a chart that speaks to hopelessness. This is a chart that tells somebody that they are destined to spend the rest of their life as a diminished version of their former self. And we wonder why suicide epidemics and opioid and the rest of it takes place. It's because people feel like their tomorrows are going to be as bad or worse than their yesterdays. On Ken's journey, he happened to meet a really interesting fellow, a guy by the name of Dr. Rich Tedeschi. And Rich had coined the term in 1995, post-traumatic growth. And this struck a chord with Ken, because one of the parts that came in our story before we started Boulder Crest was that Ken spent a great deal of time with wounded EOD service members in hospitals. And he spent time with quadruple and triple amputees, people with severe burns, and he saw that they refused to allow their injuries and their suffering to define them, that they refused to be victims, and that they insisted on using the challenges that were presented and actually creating a life that was better than it was before. And one of the best examples is Taylor Morris, a quadruple amputee. Every day had a goal. Today I'm not going to crush that brownie with my prosthetics. Tomorrow I'm going to walk X amount of feet. They told him he'd never be able to walk down the aisle at his wedding, and he did. He's about to go to New Zealand on a trip. He just graduated from college. He's got a maker studio in Iowa. So he kept seeing over and over again that what didn't kill people did make them stronger. And yet at the retreat, when families would come, we saw the opposite. And so the pivotal question is, why is it that some people take what doesn't kill them and use it to make them stronger, and other people are unable to do that? And Rich's work is really what defines the difference between those two things. And that this idea of post-traumatic growth, this idea that our life can be enriched and enhanced through struggle, through suffering, is the whole idea of post-traumatic growth. And it's what is shown on this chart behind me. It's this idea that you go down, and what you learn about yourself on the bottom of that curve is what enables you to rise above and transcend to a level that you never were at before. So let's talk a little bit about Rich and Lawrence's story. So Rich and Lawrence were both accomplished psychologists. They were young and doing good work, and they were prodigies in a lot of respects. I mean, Rich was nearing tenure at 25 years old at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And one day they were in the car talking because I think Rich was studying the science of the environmental movement and Lawrence something similar. And they were struck at the fact that once they got tenure, whatever they were studying is what they would have to study the rest of their life. And quite frankly, they were bored. And so they began this conversation to try to figure out what it was that they could do to actually study something that interested them. And as they discussed it, what they decided they wanted to study was how wisdom was gained. How it is that we meet certain people who seem wise despite their age, and others who maybe just have a lot of age but not a lot of wisdom and just experience. And so they started interviewing a host of different people. And what they found was that adults who had suffered trauma in adulthood, paralysis, losing limbs, going from being able to see to being blind, losing their hearing, those sorts of things were what actually had this stopping point, this before and after moment, that people described that their life had changed dramatically for the better. And so Rich and Lawrence continued to study this over the course of the 80s. In 1995, wrote their seminal work using the term post-traumatic growth for the first time. And then one day, Rich was asked by the folks at the university to go to a support group of bereaved parents. And he declined. He said, I don't want to go. I don't know what to say. I can't share in their experience. And they told Rich that they weren't asking him to go. They were telling him to go. And they also reminded him to heed the warning about what clinicians are meant to do when they go to a support group, and that's to allow people to support each other. And what Rich heard from these families blew his mind, because of course every single person sitting in that support group would give their own life to have their child back. That was absolute. But in the wake of their child's passing, They had found meaning in their lives. They had found a deeper sense of the purpose of their lives that enriched them in some way. And so there were stories of families whose son loved baseball who died of cancer, and so they went to the inner city and built baseball fields. There were stories of families starting nonprofits to help other parents whose kids were suffering from the same illnesses that they had been through. And it was this kind of pay it forward mentality that my pain can be purposeful to you, that my suffering can mean you suffer less, and I can use it for good. And so what Rich and Lawrence decided to do was a really important thing in the context of what you're talking about today, which is this peer support notion, is they decided to listen to the very people who had been through the struggles that they were trying to understand. They left their expert hat off, and they decided to simply be good people, good note takers. So having heard all of this from these amazing parents and their journey, which we've seen echoed, by the way, with the Sandy Hook parents who lost their kids at that school shooting in Connecticut, is the Sandy Hook parents have a rapid response team that deploys to the sites of school shootings just to sit with the other parents. And they did it at Parkland. And there's a wonderful New York Times article about how they serve as guides, which is a really important term in this context of peer support. So when Rich and Lawrence had learned all of this, they started to think, well, we can't be geniuses. We couldn't have uncovered this on our own. This has to be precedented, right? There has to be something in the literature that speaks to this occurring before. And what they found is probably, in my mind, the greatest story of post-traumatic growth in the history of the world. And that's in 1973, 591 men returned home from between 2 months and 8.5 years as prisoners of war in North Vietnam and other parts of Vietnam. And these men had been tortured and battered and bruised and imprisoned and isolated. And when they were coming home, their families were warned by the psychologists for the military that they should expect them to come home infantile, infertile, and psychotic, and that the likelihood was they would end up in insane asylums for the rest of their life. And the truth is that only 4% of these men, 4%, came home with what we would now call PTSD. And it was most of those folks were the newly shot down guys. The truth was the longer people had been in the prison, the better off they were. I'm going to say that again. The longer they were in the prison, the better off they were. 60 to 80% of these men reported that their lives were better because of their experience. And when you want to know the answer why, the answer is post-traumatic growth. All of the elements of post-traumatic growth that we're going to talk about in a minute. And when we talk about people's lives being better, what Rich and Lawrence did was listen to the voices of the folks who had been through these experiences. They honored the people who had struggled as opposed to honoring their expertise and diplomas, and sought to understand from their point of view what it was about their experience that enriched their life, made it more fulfilling and more purposeful, and yes, more serious. And they listened to all of those and they categorized them into 5 different areas. And these are what are called the domains of post-traumatic growth. The first is deeper relationships. And this is the idea that when you struggle, you're far more understanding of the importance of deep connection to other human beings. And as a result, you're much more willing to share your own story and struggle honestly and openly. And you're also much more willing to listen deeply to another person without trying to solve their problems, like I described with the Sandy Hook parents. And that's one of the gifts, the treasures of this experience of having to go into your own abyss. The second is new possibilities. And this is the idea that while some doorways have now been closed in your life and some paths are shut down, new ones can emerge and open that may even be better than you could have ever anticipated or imagined. The third is personal strength. This is the idea that if I could get through that, I can get through anything. If I can get through 7.5 years in a Hanoi Hilton prison camp, then nothing that happens to me can actually cause an issue. The next is appreciation for life, and this is twofold. One is the idea that your priorities shift about what matters in your life. When people go through deep struggle, and I've experienced this in my own life, what you think matters no longer really matters. And what tends to matter are intrinsic and internal things versus the material. And the last is spiritual and existential change. The idea that you gain a greater understanding of the meaning of life and death, of a sense of connectedness to all things. For those who are religious or have faith, they tend to be much more connected with a religious faith. It's important to note here that PTG occurs 70% of the time. We treat it and believe it's like some sort of anomaly, but in fact it's actually our birthright. It's our birthright because the story of every single organized religion, from the Jews in slavery in Egypt to Jesus on the cross to Buddhism talking about life is suffering, the only question is what do you do with it? That's why we have religion, to help us find meaning in these challenges. And the truth is, if our life was that first chart where we diminish over time based on trauma and suffering, we wouldn't exist as a species, because we would have just died off when a saber-toothed tiger went in and killed somebody in a cave and the trauma happened over and over again. We are wired to be able to not simply survive, but to thrive because of these experiences, to get stronger and smarter and wiser. And that doesn't mean they don't hurt, and it doesn't mean that we don't have days where we're anxious and don't sleep well, but it means that on the whole, that suffering has meaning, it has purpose. So Rich explains all of this to us, and we listen to it and we learn from it. And the question that we asked Rich, and the question that Ken in particular asked Rich, was as a training person. And Ken had spent time at the EOD school at Indian Head. And what he said is, Rich, I understand you've observed this phenomenon occurring in people's lives and communities. The question is, can you train somebody to achieve post-traumatic growth? Can you train them to transform deep struggle into profound strength and lifelong post-traumatic growth? And Rich's response was, I don't know, I haven't tried, but I'm willing to. And that's what set us on this journey to creating a program that for the first time ever would cultivate and facilitate post-traumatic growth. And that program is called PATH, or Progressive and Alternative Training for Healing Heroes. So one of the first things we did was work with Rich to create a clear sense of what the process of creating post-traumatic growth looked like. And so that started with an understanding of phases. Now, it's really, really important to say this is not mechanistic. It's not do this, then do this, then do this. There's a sense of iteration and cycle throughout all of these. But the chart that you see on the screen goes through those 5 phases: education, regulation, disclosure, story, and service. And the best part about it, and in the context of the meeting you guys are having today, is that post-traumatic growth is inherently democratic. It's inherently designed to enable those who have struggled and achieved post-traumatic growth in their own life to assist somebody else through that journey, because you've been there and you've done it. You have credibility by virtue of that experience, which it should make sense to everybody why that's so profound and compelling amongst a military audience who know what good leadership looks like and what bad leadership looks like. So there's no head shed when it comes to the expert guide. The expert guide is somebody who has lived it and done it. So I want to talk for a little bit about each of these 5 phases of post-traumatic growth. Talk a little bit about what it means to be an expert guide, and then shut it down. And then, like I said, I welcome your questions. And again, I'm sorry that I can't be there with you. So let's start by talking about education. Education really boils down to teaching people about 3 things. And the reason why it's so important to educate and to teach people about it is because you want folks to be able to have the keys to their own kingdom, to understand how they operate, and to understand in their own lives how they want to be. We're not trying to put answers or goals or success criteria on other people. We're trying to understand what it is in their life they're seeking. And this is another important distinction when we think about the mental health community. And there was a great op-ed in a Journal of the American Medical Association about this, which spoke about the idea that people aren't trying to feel less bad. They're trying to experience joy and connection and passion and purpose and love, and to experience being alive, not feel less bad. So there's really 3 parts of education. The first is understanding that struggle has value, and that's all about post-traumatic growth. So one of the things we do is educate people about the existence of post-traumatic growth. The same things I just told you is what I would sit in a room next week in Arizona and talk to families about. The second is understanding the impacts of trauma and struggle on the mind, body, heart, and spirit. Now, we tend to look at anxiety, depression, PTSD, and suicidality as ailments of the head. We tend to subscribe to the belief that there are far more ailments of the heart and the soul. And if you want to more about that, you should read a book called Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He was a Holocaust survivor and a psychiatrist, and he speaks about this idea that the symptoms are symptoms of a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of not really being able to interpret and understand our experiences. The third is training in how to struggle well. And as some of you might know, and I have the books in my suitcase, unfortunately I can send them there. Struggle Well is a book that Ken Falk, our founder and chairman, wrote, and I wrote with him, that speaks to our stories and our experiences and what we've learned along the way about post-traumatic growth. And it's an incredible guidebook, and I'd certainly encourage you. Obviously, I feel like it's a good effort, but I encourage you to read it if you're interested in this subject of post-traumatic growth. So that's all about education. And as I said, there's a lot in there in our book that speaks to it, and there's a particularly interesting component that Jeremy could probably share some experience about, But it's the catch-22 when we look at how we train soldier, sailor, and airmen and Marines to function downrange, and how those look the same as the symptoms for PTSD. And it's an important notion because we tend to tell people that something is wrong with them as opposed to that they're a function of their training and their experiences. And that is a point where, for us at Warrior Path, we believe very much in a model based on training as opposed to treatment. And one of the core reasons we believe that is because we think as humans, we're not well trained to struggle well. We're not well trained to deal with life. And more importantly than that, just because you've been through difficult experiences doesn't mean you're immune from them in the future. There's no spreadsheet where we get our full allotment of trauma and suffering and loss. It just doesn't work that way. So what's key is to be able to educate people and provide them with the training they require to deal with all of life's challenges, both big and bad. The second thing after education is regulation. And we firmly believe, and I think it's topical in the context of some of the speakers there today, that if you can't self-regulate, you will self-medicate. And self-regulation is all about getting to a place of calm and internal connection that allows you to see clearly, allows you to be the person you want to be each day and in each role of your life, from a parent to a friend to an employee to a leader, and to allow you to do the hard work of being open and honest and authentic and deal with struggle as opposed to shoving it down. And I want to share kind of two different worldviews when it comes to struggling well and struggling poorly. So the first is depicted in the chart on my up here. And this is what most people's lives look like. This is what struggling poorly looks like. And in this world, life lives you as opposed to you living life. So over the course of the last 2 days, I've slept 4 hours. I've had 5 different flights canceled. I've been trying desperately to get with you and be in Alabama. And I go from having a flight canceled to getting a new flight, having a flight canceled to getting a new flight, to having a flight canceled to getting a new flight. If I rode those ups and downs, I would be an emotional basket case, right? And instead, I'm kind and I'm calm and I talk nicely to the people at American Airlines, and they've been very kind and gracious in spite of all of that. But most people live their lives in a way where when good things happen, we feel good, and bad things happen, we feel bad. And that sort of roller coaster life is aided and abetted by two things. The first are unhealthy habits. Like we said, if you can't self-regulate, you will self-medicate. And the second are bad influencers. You are the average of the 3 to 5 people you spend the most time with. Let me say that again. You're the average of the 3 to 5 people you spend the most time with. If the 3 to 5 people who surround you are people who drink a lot, talk about the past a lot, complain about their relationships a lot, that is exactly what you will become. Exactly what you will become. And the flip side of that is also true. One of the other ironies about surrounding yourself with bad people, with dirtbags, is it actually makes you feel better about yourself, because at least you weren't as bad as Joe, because Joe's doing all these other things in addition to the drinking too much. Joe's cheating on his spouse. Joe's screwing around at work. And our relative comparison of how good we are changes. The second way of looking at life is in this sine wave. And in this sine wave, there's balance, right? There's still movement. There's still certainly the experience of being alive. But there's a heck of a lot more time being spent living in the present, in the middle of that chart, than in the past, in the bottom, and in the future on top. And in order to live in this sort of way, in order to struggle well, in order to be able to handle the normal and abnormal ups and downs that will come into our lives, we have to have two things. We have to have healthy wellness practices, things like journaling and meditation and exercise and good nutrition and sleep, managing our finances well in a way that doesn't create stress. And we have to be able to have kind of a spiritual center that guides us, things that relate to us, things that are bigger than us. That certainly could be your faith, but we know for sure it's a sense of service, and it's a willingness to build deep and meaningful relationships with other people. The good life is built on good relationships. And the second thing are people, right? That support network, those 3 to 5. I happen to have a 3 to 5 that's incredibly, incredibly strong, and I know Jeremy could attest to that. And because of that, I'm a better person. I'm a better man. When I struggled, I was disconnected. I was alienated. I was isolated. And the people who saved my life were veterans, and I'm a civilian. And they showed me what strength looked like. They showed me what leadership looked like. They showed me what integrity looked like. And those are really the two ways. So one of the other things we do is teach a lot of these wellness practices that allow people to regulate their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions, create internal connection that allows you to see clearly who you are and how you want to be in the world. The third part of this is disclosure. And there's an important distinction because there's quite a popular treatment called prolonged exposure. And we think there's a major difference between disclosure and exposure. Disclosure is a choice, exposure is coerced. Right? Exposure is what someone forces you to do. When you feel exposed, it's not by choice. And we prefer to think about disclosure. And the analogy we use here is a rucksack. Everybody has a limit on how much they can carry. And the truth is, when we're a little baby, we get a metaphorical rucksack put on our back, and we put stuff in it. Good stuff, bad stuff, ugly stuff, and we carry it for large parts of our life. And we get to a point where too much stuff happens, we're forced to take a knee and start to look at what's in there. And one of the truths and one of the important truths about what we've learned over the course of time about what people struggle with coming as combat veterans, it has a lot more to do with what they're coming home to than what they're coming home from. We have never seen a single instance of any kind of struggle, PTSD, anxiety, depression, or otherwise, that is solely related to stuff that happened on the battlefield. It tends to have a lot more to do than what happened before someone joined the military and what happened after they got out. And when they get out, there's significant issues related to transition. And there's a great article by a guy named George Bonanno from Columbia that I'm happy to share with you all that speaks to this idea of transition stress and the challenges sort of psychologically into your psyche and soul about getting out. But a key part of this process is being able to make peace with past experiences so you can learn to live in the present and start looking forward. And when we talk about the value and importance of peer support, people who've been there and done that, I cannot stress enough how important it is that when we think about the military brotherhood and sisterhood, that we rely and lean on that. When people ask us how we design Warrior Path, I tell them we used one of the most effective training models in the history of the world. It's called the United States military. And when we started our program, the T that stands for training now stood for therapies. Our team was much more laden with therapists. And this isn't an attack on mental health professionals. It's simply a reflection of the fact that when you have people who've been and done certain things, you want other people who can take those off the table. So we don't have chest beating. So our team is predominantly combat veterans with one mental health professional and then some random civilians like myself. And it's important because we're able to show modeling. We're able to show what post-traumatic growth looks like. The fourth phase is story. And story really relates to where are you going. If we come back to the Hanoi Hilton analogy and think about what those men decided to do, it's been coined the Stockdale paradox. And it's the idea of being acutely aware of just how messed up your situation is, right? Not deluding yourself, not being in denial, understanding just how bad your situation is. And at the same time, maintaining faith that you will not simply endure, but you will thrive. You will thrive because of the experiences you go through. And that sense, that understanding allowed them to live in the present and to be able to see the future. And their mission, their story was return with honor. They refused to return at all costs and leave their integrity and sense of self on the table in that prison and work with the Vietnamese and collaborate. And they also refused to die and not return because there was no value to that. There was no value to their family or their country. And so they chose to return with honor. And that dictated everything they did every moment. And it dictated everything they've done. That group of 591 men is some of the most accomplished individuals in the world. Admirals and congressmen and generals and business leaders and nonprofit leaders. They never stopped living with honor, and their mission was their mission. And so one of the things that's incredibly important and is distinct about this post-traumatic growth-based model is that it cares less about what happened, and it cares more about what now. What are you going to do now? What is your story? Who do you want to be? Where are you going? Because if you can't look to the future, you will get trapped in the past. That past will own you. And one of the important parts of being able to disclose is to make peace with that past. So you have the clarity and conviction to understand where you want to go and the capacity and ability to be there and get there and the training you require to get there. And we tend to think about when it comes to this generation of warriors and combat veterans, we have never in the history of our country asked so much of so few for so long. This is the first war in the history of our country where we're building a memorial at the same time the war is still taking place. The Global War on Terror Memorial has been signed off for by the president. And we are at a fork in the road. And this generation of warriors has the opportunity to be either the most entitled generation and live life as victims with their hands out, or the next greatest generation. And to take the opportunities from their training and experiences and translate that into leadership at home, just like happened after World War II. And if you need a role model for that, General Mattis is the ideal, and a man who talks about post-traumatic growth often. The last component, the last phase of post-traumatic growth is about service. And service is a critical part of everyone's life, and it ought to be. But more importantly, for the warrior, for the combat veteran, for the family member, you know what service feels like, and the sad thing is you can't ever not do it because it gives you a certain sense of fulfillment that nothing else can. That connection you had to left and right, that recognition of what you did mattered, and not worrying about motive and understanding that there was purpose in your life, that's critical. And one of the striking parts about the definition of service in this context is that it has a lot more to do with listening and sharing with other people than it does brave acts and bold acts. Because that's really fundamentally what people require. And at the heart of good therapy is people who listen deeply with unconditional positive regard and empathy and kindness. But that requires being incredibly well to do it. And on that point, when we talk about peer support, and we talk about it wherever it is, and I've had great conversations with the VA about this, we have to recognize that unwell people can't help. If you cannot swim, you cannot save someone who's drowning. If you do not put on your oxygen mask first, you cannot help somebody else get theirs on. And we put people often in really bad situations of trying to help other people when they're not well. And that is at a huge risk to people's wellness and health. And so it's important to say that. So those are the 5 phases of post-traumatic growth: education, regulation, disclosure, story, service. I could talk about them for weeks and weeks and weeks. And like I said, they're really well documented as a chapter each in our book. So I want to conclude with, I think, the most topical part about post-traumatic growth. And I think, I was just having a conversation actually while I was waiting to get on the plane here with a woman, and she was asking when I said, we're really working on innovation and transformation in the context of mental health. And she was like, I don't understand. Are you doing ecstasy or ketamine or whatever these other things are? And I said, no, the innovation is all about people. And it's about people and it's about hope. And we had a gentleman, a chaplain, who came to us and talked about how he felt like the system had endowed him with a sense of learned hopelessness. And that he had been convinced that his life was never going to be what he thought it used to be. That he would never return to the person that he was. And that the rest of his life would be some fraction of what it had been before. And it's a recipe for hopelessness. And so one of the things that's striking is over and over again when we share this idea, just the idea of post-traumatic growth with people, it creates an aperture and an opportunity that they hadn't considered, which is that their life can be better than it ever was because of their experiences. And you cannot hit what you can't see. You cannot shoot at what you can't see. Man mistakes the limits of his world for the limits of his own field of vision. Arthur Schopenhauer. We can only see what we believe exists, and if we don't know it exists, we can't find it. And if we don't tell people there's something above that line, beyond a life as a diminished version of themselves, we will see a continuation of the mental health epidemic that's not just struggling and facing veterans and their families, but our country. 25% increase in suicide since 1999 in this country. It's drastic. Opioid epidemic, as the gentleman earlier talked about, it's ravaging our communities. Those are issues of psychic pain, not physical pain. So let's talk about the expert guide. We talked about the importance of listening and sharing. And I think there's a great quote by a guy named Carl Buhner, sometimes misattributed to Maya Angelou, that says, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. Listening deeply to another human being, instilling hope into their life, showing them that you believe in them even when they don't believe in themselves, those are things that people don't forget. They leave a mark in the best ways. The other thing is that example is not the main thing in influencing others. It is the only thing. Albert Schweitzer, right? This idea that we have to be what we want other people to be. We have to be the person and the spouse and the partner and the employee that we want to have. And so that sense of being congruent, of being one, of not trying to help other people and struggling in our own lives, but being open and honest and struggling well so we can help others do the same, is the critical part of this. I'm fond when I think about all of this at a quote that's on the bottom of my email by Goethe, who's a German writer. And he said that if we treat people as they are, we will make them worse. If we treat people as they ought to be, we help them become what they're capable of becoming. When we treat you as the person above the curve instead of the person at the bottom, we enable you to see what's possible for you. And I remember a story of a woman who came to our program, and she said at the end she kept waiting for us to treat her like PTSD Jane, and we never did. We never did. We treated her as a person who had incredible capabilities and potential and strength. And when somebody sees that in your eyes, they see what's possible for themselves. So again, my apologies sincerely for not being there. I hope this video offers some solace in that respect. But I think when we think about peer support, I think what should guide us is hope and possibility. What should guide us is the opportunities for growth. What should guide us is not helping people feel less bad, but actually do more good. A second thing is we should make sure that those we're putting into places of peer support are healthy and are well, that are taking care of themselves, that understand what a good life looks like, that have a well-balanced and well-rounded life, that are held accountable, and not just assume that somebody who seems to have some leadership abilities ought to help other people. We also ought to be looking at how we can support them and keep them strong. And the third is, when Dr. Tedeschi went to a presentation recently and he shared about post-traumatic growth and asked if the people in the room had ever experienced it, he got what we would expect, which is about 7 out of 10 people, 70% of the room said yes, they had experienced that in their life. He then asked them who in their life was most helpful in that process. And it had mental health professional, clergy, friend, acquaintance, coworker. 90% of the time, the person who helped them through their process of post-traumatic growth was not a mental health professional. We have to get to a place like they did at the Hanoi Hilton where we can democratize mental health and take care of each other. The slogan in the Hanoi Hilton was, "You are your brother's keeper." That was your highest form of duty to the man next door. And we've lost sight of that because we live in a world that is far more selfish than it is selfless. And what's amazing about the military and veteran community isn't just the opportunities to be able to help support each other, but it's to help support the civilian brethren and sisters in this country who are desperately in need of strength and support and guidance, because that's what we believe. We don't serve this community because we want to say a big thank you for your service. It's not about what people have done. It's about who they've become in the process. And there's something profound about the experience. And to that end, in our gazebo in our garden in Virginia and soon in Arizona, is a quote from Thucydides. He said, "We must remember that one man is much the same as another, and that he is best who is trained in the severest school." He is best who is trained in the severest school. The severe school for many is war. That's what Thucydides was talking about. But the severe school could also be loss and suffering and trauma and difficulty for others. It is in that severe school that we learn the greatest lessons about who we are, how we want to be, and the possibilities of impacting the world. So let me conclude with one final thing, which is just the next steps. First, we're building something called the PATH Partner Network. And one of our objectives is to scale PATH to other organizations around the country. Boulder Crest has no interest in becoming a massive entity. We have properties in Virginia and Arizona. BoulderCrestRetreat.org, you'll find all the information. It's not in Colorado. And in addition, what we want to do is be able to scale our programs to work with third-party organizations, other nonprofits who want to run PATH, and create a culture and a system of innovation to help influence how mental health is done. The second is on September 12th, on and around our 5th year anniversary, we're going to launch the Boulder Crest Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth. And a core focus of the Institute is to mainstream, is to study and scale, develop and deliver PTG-based solutions to anxiety, depression, PTSD, and suicidality. And one of the major ways we want to do that is by training mental health professionals in post-traumatic growth. And Dr. Tedeschi is the distinguished chair of the Institute, and another clinical psychologist, Brett Moore, is the vice chair, and I'll run the Institute. And the third, like I said, we've got Struggle Well that's out, and that's our effort. And we wrote that book because every time we met with a civilian audience, they asked how we could help them, help their siblings, friends, cousins, parents who were struggling, who had been through stuff. And I leave you with this. There's a quote from Ian McLaren that we should be kind because everyone around us is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Struggle is pervasive in our world, and struggling poorly is even more pervasive. And we each have an opportunity in our own lives to impact other people based on not what we say, but what we do and how we live our lives. We are a walking and talking example. Just like kids, what we do is far more important than what we say. Video and the audio are not equal. And so what I encourage you to think as we reflect on this is how we can support not only combat veterans and their families, but more broadly society, and position this generation for their rightful title as the next greatest generation and not the most entitled. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I will promise and pledge that I will come back to Mobile and we will have another discussion in person. But I welcome your questions, comments, concerns, and thoughts, and happy to talk to you more about anything. Thank you all.